Welcome to TM News. Ukraine-Russia war live updates, more military bases in western Russia if NATO expands further east. Foreign Minister says Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said on Friday that moves by Finland and Sweden to join NATO were part of an increase in military threats near Russia's western borders, and it was taking adequate countermeasures. Stay with Toy for all updates. G7 countries to provide $19.8 billion in aid to Ukraine. The group of 7 leading economies and global financial institutions are providing $19.8 billion in aid to bolster Ukraine's public finances, Germany's finance minister said Friday. Christian Lindner told reporters that $9.5 billion of the total was mobilized at meetings of the G7 finance ministers this week. He says the goal is to ensure that Ukraine's financial situation does not impact Ukraine's ability to defend itself from Russia's invasion. Russia's Rosneft says German ex-Chancellor Schroeder leaves board. Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder will leave the board of directors of Russian oil giant Rosneft, the company said on Friday, following public pressure. Rosneft said that Schroeder and Nord Stream 2 CEO Matthias Warnig informed the company that it was impossible to extend their powers on the board of directors, a day after Germany stripped Schroeder of official perks over ties with Russia. Russia to halt gas flows to Finland on Saturday. Russia's Gazprom has informed Finland that it will halt flows of natural gas from Saturday morning, Finnish state-owned gas wholesaler Gazprom said on Friday. Gazprom has refused to pay Gazprom export in rubles as Russia has requested European countries to do. Gazprom said it will continue to supply gas to Finnish customers from other sources through the Baltic Connector pipeline connecting Finland with Estonia. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Moscow would create new military bases in western Russia in response to the expansion of NATO. Russia claims nearing full control of Ukraine breakaway region of Lugansk. Russian troops likely to redeploy from Mariupol with the number of defenders left holed up in a Mariupol steel factory dwindling. Russian commanders will be coming under increasing pressure to reallocate troops from the strategic southern port city to bolster their offensive in eastern Ukraine. Britain's defense ministry said Friday. More than 1,700 defenders of the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol have surrendered since Monday, Russian authorities said, in what appeared to be the final stage in the nearly 3-month siege of the now pulverized port city. 12 killed in Russian attacks in Severodonetsk. Russian forces attacked the cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk in Ukraine's eastern region of Luhansk, the region's governor said Friday. Surai Haidai said in a Telegram messaging app post on Friday that 12 people were killed in Severodonetsk as a result of the assault, and more than 60 houses were destroyed across the region. Biden leaves for Asia under Ukraine, North Korea nuclear shadows. President Joe Biden left Thursday for South Korea and Japan to cement U.S. leadership in Asia at a time when the White House's attention has been pulled back to Russia and Europe, and amid fears of a North Korean nuclear test during his trip. Ukrainian troops surrendering at Mariupol registered as POWs. Kiev, the fate of hundreds of Ukrainian fighters who surrendered after holding out against punishing attacks on Mariupol's steel factory hung in the balance Thursday, amid international fears that the Russians may take reprisals against the prisoners. The International Committee of the Red Cross gathered personal information from hundreds of the soldiers, name, date of birth, closest relative, and registered them as prisoners of war, as part of its role in ensuring the humane treatment of POWs under the Geneva Conventions. Amnesty International said in a tweet that the Ukrainian soldiers are now prisoners of war and as such, must not be subjected to any form of torture or ill treatment. More than 1,700 defenders of the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol have surrendered since Monday, Russian authorities said, in what appeared to be the final stage in the nearly 3-month siege of the now pulverized port city. At least some of the fighters were taken by the Russians to a former penal colony in territory controlled by Moscow-backed separatists. Others were hospitalized, according to a separatist official. But an undisclosed number remained in the warren of bunkers and tunnels in the sprawling plant. In a brief video message, the deputy commander of the Azov regiment, which led the defense of the steel mill, said he and other fighters were still inside. An operation is underway, the details of which I will not announce, Sviatoslav Palomar said. President Volodymyr Zelensky said he was working to ensure that the most influential international forces are informed and, as much as possible, involved in saving our troops. While Ukraine expressed hope for a prisoner exchange, Russian authorities have threatened to investigate some of the Azovstal fighters for war crimes and put them on trial, branding them Nazis and criminals. The Azov regiment's far-right origins have been seized on by the Kremlin as part of an effort to cast Russia's invasion as a battle against Nazi influence in Ukraine. Meanwhile, in the first war crimes trial held by Ukraine, a captured Russian soldier testified that he shot an unarmed civilian in the head on an officer's orders, and he asked the victim's widow to forgive him. The soldier pleaded guilty earlier in the week, but prosecutors presented the evidence against him in line with Ukrainian law. In the Poltava region, 2 other Russian soldiers appeared in court Thursday on war crimes charges that they shelled civilians. Prosecutors said both pleaded guilty. The next court session in their case was set for May 26. Also, more U.S. aid appeared to be on its way to Ukraine when the Senate overwhelmingly approved a $40 billion package of military and economic aid for the country and its allies. The House voted for it last week. President Joe Biden's quick signature was certain. Help is on the way, really significant help. Help that could make sure that the Ukrainians are victorious, said Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Taking the Azovstal steel plant would allow Russia to claim complete control of Mariupol and secure a long-sought victory. But it would be a mostly symbolic victory at this point, since the city is already effectively in Moscow's hands and analysts say most of the Russian forces that were tied down by the battle there have already left. Kiev's troops, bolstered by Western weapons, thwarted Russia's initial goal of storming the capital, Kiev, and have put up stiff resistance against Moscow's forces in the Donbass, the eastern industrial region that President Vladimir Putin has set his sights on capturing. The surprising success of Ukraine's troops has buoyed Kiev's confidence. Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to Zelensky who was involved in several rounds of talks with Russia, said in a tweet addressed to Moscow, "Do not offer us a ceasefire, this is impossible without total Russian troops withdrawal. Until Russia is ready to fully liberate occupied territories, our negotiating team is weapons, sanctions and money," he wrote. Russia, though, again signaled its intent to incorporate or at least maintain influence over areas its troops have seized. Deputy Prime Minister Marat Kusnulin this week visited the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, large parts of which have been under the control of Russian forces since shortly after the invasion began in February. He was quoted by Russian news agencies as saying the regions could become part of our Russian family. Also, Volodymyr Saldo, the Kremlin-installed head of the Kherson region, appeared in a video on Telegram saying Kherson will become a subject of the Russian Federation. In other developments, Jean-Marc Milley, chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, spoke by phone on Thursday with his Russian counterpart for the first time since the war began, and they agreed to keep the lines of communications open, the Pentagon said. On the battlefield, Ukraine's military said Russian forces pressed their offensive in various sections of the front in the Donbass but were being repelled. The governor of the Luhansk region said Russian shelling killed 4 civilians, while separatist authorities in Donetsk said Ukrainian shelling killed 2. Zelensky said 12 people were killed and dozens more wounded in the city of Severodonetsk, and attacks on the northeastern Chernihiv region included a severe strike on the village of Desna, where many more died and rescuers were still going through the rubble. On the Russian side of the border, the governor of Kursk province said a truck driver was killed by shelling from Ukraine. At the war crimes trial in Kiev, SGT Vadim Shishimarin, a 21-year-old member of a Russian tank unit, told the court that he shot Alexander Shilipov, a 62-year-old Ukrainian civilian, in the head on orders from an officer. Shishimarin said he disobeyed a first order but felt he had no choice but to comply when it was repeated by another officer. He said he was told the man could pinpoint the troops' location to Ukrainian forces. A prosecutor has disputed that Shishimarin was acting under orders, saying the direction didn't come from a direct commander. Shishimarin apologized to the victim's widow, Katerina Shalapova, who described seeing her husband being shot just outside their home in the early days of Russia's invasion. She told the court that she believes Shishimarin deserves a life sentence, the maximum possible, but that she wouldn't mind if he were exchanged as part of a swap for the Azovstal defenders. U.S. accuses Russia of weaponizing food in Ukraine war. United Nations. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken accused Russia on Thursday of weaponizing food and holding grain for millions of people around the world hostage to help accomplish what its invasion of Ukraine has not, to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. He told a UN Security Council meeting called by the United States that the war has halted maritime trade in large areas of the Black Sea and made the region unsafe for navigation, trapping Ukrainian agricultural exports and jeopardizing global food supplies. Blinken said the meeting, which he chaired, was taking place at a moment of unprecedented global hunger, fueled by climate change and COVID-19, and made even worse by conflict. Since Russia's invasion on February 24, he said, its naval operations have sought to control access to the northwestern Black Sea and the Sea of Azov and to block Ukrainian ports, which the United States assesses to be a deliberate effort to block safe passage and shut down shipping. As a result of the Russian government's actions, some 20 million tons of grain sit unused in Ukrainian silos as global food supplies dwindle, prices skyrocket, causing more around the world to experience food insecurity, Blinken said. Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia dismissed as absolutely false claims by the US and Western nations that we want to starve everyone to death and that only you and Ukraine allegedly care about how to save the lives of the country. You assert that allegedly we are preventing agricultural products from being taken out of Ukraine by sea, he said. However, the truth is that it is Ukraine and not Russia that has blocked 75 vessels from 17 states in the ports of Mykolaiv, Kherson, Chernomorsk, Mariupol, Okhotsk, Odessa, and Yuzhny and has mined the waterways. Nebenzia warned that, unless this issue is resolved, we cannot speak of any opportunities to export Ukrainian grain by sea. He stressed that Russia remains a responsible supplier of both food and energy. Russia expects a record wheat crop and can offer to export 25 million tons of grain from August 1 until the end of the year through the Novorossiysk port, he said, and it is also ready to discuss at least 22 million tons of fertilizer for export from June to December. But Nebenzia said more than 10,000 sanctions on Russia have disrupted transportation routes, impeded movement of Russian vessels and banned them from entering ports, caused freight and insurance problems, restricted commercial transactions and created difficulties with banking transactions. If you do not want to lift your sanctions of choice, then why are you accusing us of causing this food crisis? He asked. Why is it that as a result of your irresponsible geopolitical games, the poorest countries and regions must suffer? Blinken called Russia's claims that sanctions are to blame for the worsening global food crisis false, declaring that the decision to weaponize food is Moscow's and Moscow's alone. Sanctions aren't blocking Black Sea ports, trapping ships filled with food, and destroying Ukrainian roads and railways. Russia is, he said. Sanctions are not emptying Ukrainian grain silos and stealing Ukrainian farm equipment. Russia is. Blinken said sanctions imposed by the US and many others aren't preventing Russia from exporting food and fertilizers because they exempt exports of food, fertilizer, and seeds. And we're working with countries every day to ensure that they understand that sanctions do not prevent the flow of these items, he said. UN Food Chief David Beasley warned the Security Council that the war in Ukraine has created an unprecedented crisis of escalating food prices that are already sparking protests and riots and growing hunger that will add at least 47 million people to the 276 million marching to starvation before Russia's invasion of its smaller neighbor. The executive director of the World Food Programme said 49 million people in 43 countries are already knocking on famine's door. Beasley recalled that when food prices got out of control in 2007 and 2008, over 40 countries faced political unrest, riots and protests. We are already seeing riots and protesting taking place as we speak, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Pakistan, Peru, he said. We've seen destabilizing dynamics already in the Sahel from Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad. These are only signs of things to come. Beasley urged world leaders to do everything possible to bring the markets to stability because things will get worse. Ukraine's Zelensky says military situation in Donbas region is like hell, cites what he calls senseless Russian bombardment. White House says Biden will sign Ukraine funding bill while traveling in Asia, reports Reuters. Ukraine's Zelensky says Donbas region has been completely destroyed. Chinese efforts to replenish reserves with Russian oil would not violate U.S. sanctions, says White House. EU exploring using oligarchs' frozen assets to rebuild Ukraine, says von der Leyen, reports Reuters. Congress approved a $40 billion aid package for Ukraine Thursday, the latest tranche of U.S. assistance under President Joe Biden's promise of unwavering support for Kiev in its fight against Russia's invasion, reports AFP. The last time the two spoke by telephone was on February 11, when Washington was warning publicly of Russian plans to invade Ukraine and was hoping its warnings would discourage Moscow from moving ahead. Russia's Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov and U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley held a phone call, RIA News Agency reported on Thursday, citing the Russian Defense Ministry. They discussed issues of mutual interest, including Ukraine, RIA said. Top U.S. Russian generals speak for first time since Ukraine war began. Pentagon. Turkey's leader opposes having Sweden and Finland join NATO, but the military alliance's top official says he expects the issue to be resolved and the two Nordic nations to become members soon. Twitter Inc. will begin placing warning notices in front of some misleading content regarding the conflict in Ukraine and limit the spread of claims debunked by humanitarian groups or other credible sources, the social media company said on Thursday. Russian shelling of the eastern Ukraine city of Severodonetsk left at least 12 people dead and another 40 injured, the region's governor Sergei Gaidai said on Thursday, as Moscow army continued its slow push into Donbas. French President Emmanuel Macron has reiterated concerns about the risk of the war in Ukraine spreading to surrounding countries, as he hosted the president of Moldova, Ukraine's neighbor. Macron said on Thursday that a spread of the conflict to neighboring countries cannot be excluded, pointing to recent incidents in the Transnistria region of Moldova, where Russian troops are already stationed and where there have been explosions. French President Emmanuel Macron has reiterated concerns about the risk of the war in Ukraine spreading to surrounding countries, as he hosted the president of Moldova, Ukraine's neighbor. BRICS ministers discussed the situation in Ukraine and supported talks between Russia and Ukraine. They expressed concern at the energy and food security implications of the conflict. India's statement on BRICS FMS meet, "We have to secure the liquidity of the Ukrainian state," German Finance Minister Christian Lindner, whose country holds the rotating presidency of the group, told reporters on entering the talks. Lindner said he was optimistic the group would be able to provide the funding Ukraine will need over coming months. Russian forces have surrounded Severodonetsk and its sister city Lysychansk, split by a river marking a central front of the war, and are pelting them with fire in an apparent effort to wear down their resistance and starve them of supplies. Ukraine says giant Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant can't supply Russia. Ukraine has dismissed as wishful thinking Russia's plan to connect a giant Ukrainian nuclear power station to the Russian electricity grid. Russian troops are occupying the sprawling Zaporizhzhia plant by the Dnieper River in southern Ukraine. It is Europe's biggest nuclear plant. The Ukrainian staff are still operating it, but Russia has sent its own nuclear experts to monitor their work. Russia's deputy prime minister has vowed to sell power from it to Ukraine. Marat Kusnulin said Russia would integrate the Zaporizhzhia plant with Russia's energy system if Kiev refused to pay for the plant's electricity. Visiting Russian-occupied southern Ukraine on Wednesday, he said, "If the Ukrainian energy system is ready to receive and pay for it, then we'll work, but if not, then the plant will work for Russia." However, a spokesman for Ukraine's state nuclear agency Energoatom said it would take years to link the plant to Russia. The plant only works in Ukraine's energy grid, Leonid Oleynik told the BBC. The Russians can build a power line theoretically, but it will take a long time, like their Crimean bridge, several years, he said, referring to the bridge connecting Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, to Russian territory. Now the power station is working at a minimum level, but Kiev remains in charge. All the power lines are controlled by Ukraine. The Russian statement is wishful thinking, Mr. Olenek added. Normally the plant generates more than half of Ukraine's nuclear power and 20% of the country's total electricity supply. But now just 2 of its 6 reactors are operating. Ukrainian forces still control the city of Zaporizhia, on the opposite bank of the Dnieper. The nuclear power plant is in Enerodar, a town of nearly 53,000 built in Soviet times to house the nuclear workers. There have been several protest rallies in Enerodar against the Russian occupation, violently broken up by Russian security forces with tear gas and stun grenades. During his visit, Mr. Kusnulin said, "I think this region's future is to work in our friendly Russian family." On March 3, Russian forces shelled the Zaporizhia plant, and later took control of it. Buildings around one of its reactors were damaged, according to Energodom. The UN nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, said radiation levels and reactor safety were not affected. World leaders condemned Russia for the attack, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of nuclear terror. The IAEA says the situation at the plant now remains fragile and unsustainable, as Russian troops keep the staff under tight surveillance, along with a team of experts from Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear agency. The IAEA says it is trying to negotiate an inspection visit to the site. Mr. Olenek said, "The staff feel bad, because there's a lot of technical pressure on them. The Russians are behaving as occupiers." He said Russia was keeping about 500 troops and 50 armored vehicles at the site. "They're checking documents, they don't let people speak freely and break up meetings in Enerodar." He insisted that Ukraine will liberate the whole territory, no deals with the occupiers. Russia's temporary occupation of Chernobyl in northern Ukraine, site of the world's worst nuclear disaster in 1986, also alarmed world leaders. The radiation level at the decommissioned plant is reported to be stable and within safe limits, but there are hotspots in places nearby where Russian soldiers dug trenches. There have been some forest fires in the exclusion zone around the plant, not directly threatening it, Mr. Olenek said. But he added, "Firefighters cannot go there as so many mines were laid, it's too dangerous." After Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and parts of the Donbas region, he said, Ukraine stockpiled nuclear fuel, so now it has enough to last 2 years. Ukraine now has a deal with U.S. power company Westinghouse to provide nuclear fuel, with the goal of replacing the 40% of nuclear fuel that Kiev still gets from Moscow. Russia halts gas supplies to Finland. Russia is halting its supply of natural gas to Finland, the Finnish state-owned energy firm Gazprom says. Finland has been refusing to pay for its supplies in rubles. But it also follows an announcement that Finland will apply for NATO membership. Gazprom said the move was regrettable but said there would be no disruption to customers. Despite the Ukraine conflict, Russia continues to supply gas to many European countries. After Western powers sanctioned Russia over the war, Russia said unfriendly countries must pay for gas using the Russian currency, a move the EU considers blackmail. Reliance on Russian energy is a contributing factor in the cost of living crisis faced by many consumers. Finland imports most of its gas from Russia, but gas accounts for less than a tenth of the country's energy consumption. It is highly regrettable that natural gas supplies under our supply contract will now be halted, said Gazprom CEO Mika Wieljainen. However, we have been carefully preparing for this situation, and provided that there will be no disruptions in the gas transmission network, we will be able to supply all our customers with gas in the coming months, he added. Asked about the matter, a Kremlin spokesman said, "It is obvious that nobody is going to deliver anything for free." On Sunday, Russia also cut electricity supplies to Finland. It had threatened retaliation should Finland apply to join NATO. In a separate development, Russia's state-owned oil company Rosneft said on Friday that former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder had informed them he would no longer serve on their board. Mr. Schroeder has faced increasing public outrage over the lucrative role. He has refused to criticize Russia's President Vladimir Putin over the conflict, who he counts as a personal friend. Ukraine war in maps, tracking the Russian invasion. Russian forces are continuing their slow advance in the east of the country after using heavy firepower to weaken Ukraine's defenses. Here are the latest developments. Bombardment of Donbas region by Russia forces is intensifying. Russian troops withdrawn from Kharkiv redeployed in Donetsk. Russia preparing offensive to take key city of Severodonetsk. Ongoing buildup of Russian navy around Snake Island. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, but Ukrainian forces retook large areas around Kiev in early April after Russia abandoned its push towards the capital. Following the withdrawal from the north of Ukraine, Russia has refocused its efforts on taking control of the east and south of the country. Slow Russian advances continues in east. Russian officials have said its forces are fighting for the complete liberation of the Donbas, which broadly refers to Ukraine's eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russian-backed separatists held significant territory before the invasion. The focus of Russian forces in recent weeks has been around the city of Izium and to the east towards Severodonetsk. Ukrainian forces have been successful in repelling recent Russian advances around Izium, according to the Institute for the Study of War. But Russian troops have made progress in the Luhansk region, taking control of Rubizny and Popasna as they move towards their target of Severodonetsk. To the north, however, Ukrainian forces have now pushed the majority of Russian forces away from Kharkiv, the country's second-largest city. The ISW reports that Russian troops withdrawn from around Kharkiv are now being redeployed to the Donetsk region. Russia targets full control of South. Russian forces initially made rapid gains in the south, with their main objective being the creation of a land corridor between Crimea, which it annexed in 2014, and areas held by Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. But strong resistance from Ukrainian forces near Mykolaiv in the west and in Mariupol in the east significantly slowed Russian advances. Russia has now taken control of the port city of Mariupol, which its forces encircled at the start of March, after more than 2 months of fierce Ukrainian resistance. Several hundred Ukrainian troops who were holed up in the Azovstal metal works factory in the south of the city have now surrendered. To the west, Russia had aimed to take control of Odessa and cut off Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, but its forces were blocked by a staunch defense in Mykolaiv and forced back towards Kherson by a Ukrainian counteroffensive in March. In the Black Sea, Russia is continuing efforts to reinforce its troops on Snake Island. The roughly 16-hectare rocky outpost is owned by Ukraine but was taken over by Russian forces in February. Ukraine roundup, widow confronts soldier and George Bush's gaffe. The widow of a Ukrainian civilian shot dead in the first days of the invasion confronted the soldier accused of killing him, as the country's first war crimes trial continued on Thursday. Katerina Shalapova stood up in court and asked the soldier, "Do you repent of the crime you committed?" "Yes, I admit guilt," Vadim Shishamarin, a 21-year-old Russian tank commander, responded. "I apologize for everything I have done." Ukrainian prosecutors are asking for him to be sentenced to life imprisonment for the killing of 62-year-old Alexander Shalapov. The BBC's Sarah Rainsford has been following the landmark trial. Click here to read more. Meanwhile, there was a strong endorsement of Finland and Sweden's NATO membership bids from the U.S. President Joe Biden said the Nordic nations had the full, total, complete backing of the U.S., adding they met every requirement, and then some. Read the full story here. On the ground in Ukraine, Russia said nearly 800 more fighters from the besieged steelworks in Mariupol had surrendered in the past 24 hours. It is unclear how many fighters remain at the site. The fall of the port city represents a strategic victory for Moscow, which is pressing on with its main offensive in the eastern Donbas region. Bush condemns Putin's invasion of Iraq instead of Ukraine. Former U.S. President George W. Bush has accidentally condemned Vladimir Putin's invasion of Iraq, before correcting himself by saying he was talking about Ukraine. Mr. Bush made the gaffe during a speech at an event in Dallas, Texas, where he was talking about the importance of fair elections. He made a reference to the Russian leader's wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean of Ukraine. Mr. Bush was the president during the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was justified due to weapons of mass destruction that were never found. Russian McDonald's buyer to rebrand restaurants. McDonald's has found a local buyer for its Russian business, after the war in Ukraine pushed it to quit the country. Alexander Gover, who currently operates 25 McDonald's restaurants in Siberia, will take on the firm's restaurants and staff, operating them under a new brand, the fast food giant said. It did not disclose the sale price, but has warned investors it would take a more than $1 billion hit from the exit. McDonald's had operated in Russia for more than 30 years. The opening of its first restaurant in Moscow in 1990 came to symbolize a thaw in Cold War tensions. A year later, the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia opened up its economy to companies from the West. More than 3 decades later, however, it is one of a growing number of corporations pulling out as the war in Ukraine and Western sanctions make it difficult to operate. McDonald's, which had nearly 850 restaurants in the country, most of them directly owned, said it expected the deal, which is subject to regulatory approval, to close in coming weeks. Mr. Gover has been a licensee of McDonald's since 2015. He is also co-founder of Neftekimservice, a refining company, and a board member of another firm that owns the park and hotel and private clinics in Siberia. Ukraine war could cause global food crisis. UN McDonald's to leave Russia for good after 30 years. Russia's Industry and Trade Minister Denis Manturov said the deal was the result of a long and difficult negotiation process and the government would provide Mr. Gover with all the necessary assistance to set up operations. The terms provide for McDonald's 62,000 staff in Russia to be retained for at least 2 years, with their existing pay, and Mr. Gover will pay the salaries of corporate staff in Russia until the deal is completed. McDonald's will retain its trademark in the country, it said, while the restaurants will be stripped of their menu, logo, and other branding. Announcing plans for the sale earlier this week, Chief Executive Chris Kempczinski called the decision extremely difficult. However, we have a commitment to our global community and must remain steadfast in our values. And our commitment to our values means that we can no longer keep the arches shining there, he said. McDonald's suspended operations at the restaurants it owned in Russia in March, citing the humanitarian crisis and unpredictable operating environment caused by the Ukraine war. The move drew outrage among Russian politicians and prompted threats the business would be seized. A patent application for an Uncle Vanya restaurant chain was filed with Russian authorities shortly after. The name, the same as the famous work by Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, was one of several brand knockoffs of Western companies to surface. Last year, Russia and Ukraine accounted for about 9% of McDonald's revenue. The move by McDonald's came after French carmaker Renault sold its majority stake in carmaker Avtovaz to a state research institute for a symbolic sum, while its Renault Russia business was taken over by the city of Moscow. Manufacturing at the Renault plant is expected to resume under a Soviet-era brand.